Hello world, I'm Nick, software engineer and .NET enthusiast, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can deploy a Blazor Server project to Microsoft Azure. We're going to be covering how to create app services in Azure and then how to use Visual Studio to deploy our Blazor Server app to the cloud. But before we get into the specifics, if you haven't already done so, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more great .NET content. So assuming you've already built a Blazor application, then you can just start from the point you want to publish, essentially. But for me, I've just created a Blazor Server demo, and I've probably used this in a couple of other Blazor videos, but it is simply the starter template. And what I'm going to do is create a new app service. So this is what we use in Azure to host the actual web application. And then I'm going to set everything up in Visual Studio to point to that app service in my Azure subscription. I'll then be able to then build the application and deploy it via Visual Studio, and we'll look in the browser to see if it's running. So here's my Azure portal, and I've just gone into the main page and clicked Create a Resource because we're going to be starting from scratch. And in this case, we're going to want to create a web app. So I'll go over here to web app, click create, and we should get a new page that we can fill in to get this app service set up. So the first thing we look at is the subscription. I only have one subscription here, so I'm going to be using that Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. And then the resource group here. If you're not familiar with resource groups, they are a collection of resources in Azure that you can put together in a logical way. So you may have a resource group for testing for a certain project. You may have a production resource group for another project which has lots of different resources. So we have the choice here of whether we want to use an existing resource group or if we want to create a new one. In this case, I'm going to create a new one. So I'm going to click the Create New button, and I'm just going to give it a title. So I'm going to say that this is called Nick Demo RG for resource group, and I'll just put 001. So we click OK, and we've got our new resource group, and then we need to give the web app a name. So by default, this will form the URL for the web app. And we're not going to go into detail around the domains and the changing of the URL, for example. That's for another video. But whatever name you put in here is going to be that name.azurewebsites.net. So that'll be the URL that we're going to once everything's been published. So I'm going to put Nick Blazor Demo, and you can see if I left it like that, at the moment that's saying that's available. If I just left it as Nick, you can see Azure straight away tells me that that's not available because somebody else has taken that already. So Nick Blazor Demo or Blazor Publish Demo, and then I'll put 01 against that. So it's fairly unique, and that is available. Then we need to say what we're actually publishing. So you have several different options when it comes to publishing a web app. In our case, we're simply going to be publishing the code itself, but you can publish a Docker container. So that would be a container that you've set up in Azure, or that you're setting up in Azure, which has containerized the application, or you could set it as a static web app. So in most cases, if you're, for example, publishing a Blazor WebAssembly application, you might want to do it as a static web app. So we're doing it a Blazor Server application, so it's perfectly fine for us to use code. Then we have to select a runtime stack. So runtime stack essentially means the language ecosystem that you're using. So obviously for us, we're using .NET, and it also depends on what version of .NET we're using. So be really careful that you ensure that whatever project you're publishing, the web app supports that .NET version. It does depend on whether you use a self-contained or built-in framework, and I'll go into that in more detail when we get to Visual Studio. So I want to choose .NET 7 because that's the runtime version that I'm using for .NET on this project. As you can see, if I go over to Visual Studio and go to Properties, I've got Target Framework .NET 7. So that matches up with the application. Then you choose an operating system. So essentially you want to say, I want the web server that's hosting this to have a specific OS. Now, Windows tends to be, from experience, I haven't checked it in a while, but I think Windows can be a bit more expensive. partially because you would have a Windows license for that application. It might have changed, so probably need to look into that one. But more often than not, if you can, I just use Linux because there's no licensing required for that. And if that is the case, then it's going to be cheaper. Then we come to a region. So obviously by default, this is put East US. I'm not located in the East US, as you may have guessed. I know it's a surprise. I'm actually in the UK. So if I type UK, we get the choice between UK South and UK West. Now, because of where I'm located in the UK, I could do with a UK North, just saying, Azure, but actually I'm just going to go UK South because it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to me. Then we need to choose a pricing plan. So this is where we get tasty. This is where we look at where we're actually going to spend some money. Now there is a free plan for app services. You're very limited on what you get. You'll probably find that the app takes a long time to load, but essentially you create a plan or use an existing plan, and within that plan you have the pricing. So it automatically chooses a previous plan that you had in place. So at the moment it's choosing ASP Proud Garden Services. Now, just to let you know, I'm not starting up as a gardener. That's not a side project I'm running. My brother runs a gardening business. So if you're in Staffordshire, Cheshire, look up Proud Garden Services, represent. So I was creating a test website for him, and that's why I've got this free pricing plan on here. I'm not being cheap. Sorry, bro. But I want to create a new one for this. So I'll click create new, and then I'm going to go over to, I'm going to use some naming conventions. So I'm going to say BLZ. I'm choosing that as denoting Blazor. And then I'll put Nick demo plan. You know, just keep a plan up and running for if I want to publish some demo stuff. Click OK. Now, this is where you have to be really careful because this can happen in a lot of scenarios with Azure when you're working in the portal. So if you don't want to spend loads of money, pay attention. So the pricing plan will by default be premium version 3. So you know, if we look at that, £89.73 per month estimated. We don't need that for this. Maybe at some point, you know, if our application scales, but when we're first starting, you really don't need that premium tier unless it is justified. You know, for developers learning, then you know you just need to downscale your tier. So just be aware of that. You know, it does default to a more costly pricing tier. So if I scroll back up to the top of popular plans, it does show you the free plan, and this gives you 60 CPU minutes per day, which means, you know, if you were continuously using that application for that amount of time, that's how long you'd be able to use it. Or the server was running CPU load for that amount of time each day. I'm not going to cheap out on this one like I did for my brother with his gardening business. I'm going to go for the basic B1. So that's giving me one CPU with just under 2 gigs of RAM, and, you know, for the purposes of a demo, it's overkill, but I just want to demonstrate, you know, choosing a different plan besides just free. So I'll click that one for B1, and you can also click explore pricing plans, and it will give you a list of all the different plans for your web app. So here, this table will break down popular options, but it'll also group them into different categories. So dev and test, this is, you know, Microsoft giving you an example of what would suit a certain use case, which I find really helpful once you drill into it. So for dev and test, it recommends you use one of these basic workloads, and you can see here for the cost per hour, you know, you're looking at less than a penny for the basic B1, and then it gives you a cost per month. You know, you're going to be paying, you know, just shy of £11 a month, whatever that translates to in dollars for my American cousins. So that's the one I've chosen, and you can weigh up essentially what resources you're getting with that. So if you're happy with, you know, the amount of remote storage, the amount of memory, and the virtual CPU cores that you're getting, then great, that's the one to go for. And don't be afraid to start small and scale up. You can change this if you need to. So back to the creation screen. So we've pretty much filled out everything on this tab, and you could just click review and create, but the thing I like about the Azure Portal interface is that they've made a wizard for it so that you can check through lots of different steps before you deploy. So if actually we click next and we go to deployment, we've got lots of different options here. I'm not going to fill these out, but you can see the art of the possible. So essentially, if you were using GitHub Actions, for example, for your continuous deployment, you can turn that on, link it up to your GitHub account, and then link it to a specific branch, and then hey presto, you've got some CI/CD on your application. It's really cool how that links in. Next tab, you've got networking. So by default, the app has public access enabled. So that means the application is visible on the public internet, which is what you'd expect for the default option. If you turn that off, you'll have to start whitelisting specific IPs, but I think you can also allow virtual networks or VNets in Azure to have specific access if required. That is definitely another video. So for me, I just want this to be publicly available, so I'll leave it as it is. Next, for monitoring, there's a tool called Application Insights, which is in use for Azure resources, and that gives you all your metrics for app services or web apps. It gives you network traffic, any failed requests. You can dig into where that hit a database or any other cloud resource, but it isn't free. So if we look at the App Insights pricing, you can see by default, I think you get the basic logs. I'm just going to switch this over to UK for my reference, just feeling selfish. So if I was looking at basic, then I've got, pay as you go, about 50 pence. So that's, taking a guess, don't know the actual currency conversion, but I'd just guess 30 cents. I'm going to look at that actually. Let's have a look. East US, United States. I was completely wrong. So it's just 50 cents per gigabyte or 50 pence in the UK. So it's not really going to break the bank, but just be aware that that does charge you. So you could turn it off if you want to, but there's a trade-off to this. You wouldn't get any metrics. And when you turn it on, I'm pretty sure you'd only get metrics from that point. It would make sense. So, by default for production, or big development projects rather than just my personal projects, if I don't need application insights, I tend to turn it off, but I would advise you consider leaving it on if you're doing this at work. Next up we have tags. So this is really useful. I use this a lot in my day job, where I can essentially say that this resource has a certain category. So in my work at Nextbotics, we have resources which are only really for specific customers. And unfortunately, I have to do a lot of reporting to the finance team. So lots of spreadsheets to say, hey, this customer cost us this much in cloud infrastructure this month. So to make my own life easier, I created a tag called cost category. And then I could put overhead if it was not a customer-based cost, or I can put the customer name in there if it is attributed to a specific customer. So that's one use case for tags. And I also put in a policy which requires tags. So anyone in my team who's trying to create resources in Azure, they can't do so unless they say who's paying the bill. But you can use this for lots of different things. You could tag it with development, prototype, whatever you want, and that will show up against the resource. I find this really useful for auditing, just knowing what your resources are for. And then the final step will be the review and create step. So the wizard will always validate what you've done to make sure that it's all good, that an app service could be created. You can see a summary of everything you've set up. So I've got my estimated price front and center. Again, Microsoft thinking about just making it really clear how much your estimated bill will be before you make these resources. You've got the details about the application, the runtime stack, .NET 7. We're in Linux for an operating system. This is the amount of memory we've got. So all those things you can check before you hit create. And so deployment is now in progress. All we have to do is sit back and wait for Azure to spin up a fresh new web app. So that took around, I'd say 30 seconds, which is pretty good. And you can see the deployment is complete. So if I click go to resource, that takes me over to the page for our new web app. And you can see the status of the web app by default is that it's running. But if I go to the URL that's over here, you should get a standard page, basically says, ready to receive your web app. So it's a running web app, but there is actually no code. So it's kind of useless at this point. Now, it doesn't normally take this long to load. But what I have found, just as an FYI, when you first create a resource, a web app resource, you sometimes do have a warm-up phase, especially when you're starting the web app, if you're restarting it for whatever reason. So you might see a bit of a slowdown. And also bear in mind, I've put this on quite a low-spec machine. So the first time I run it, it's taking a little while to load, but that is to be expected. And there you go. There's the page that we get by default when we've not deployed anything. So it's running and it's waiting for content. So how about we give it some content then? So we've got our project here. As I said, you may have seen in the previous video when I was talking about Blazor Server and Blazor Assembly. We've got this application which has got the standard stuff. It's got the weather forecast service. It's got the main page for fetching that data. And we just want to take that. Instead of running it locally, we want to deploy it to Azure so that when we go to that URL, we can see the application on the public internet. So Visual Studio has integration for deploying to Azure, and you have lots of options for deployment. You don't have to use Visual Studio. You can actually use Visual Studio Code, the lighter version, the more text editor based version of Visual Studio, or you can do it directly through the portal. You can do it through the CLI. There's loads of ways you can do it. As you saw before, you can do it through GitHub Actions. I'm just going to show you a simple way through Visual Studio. And also you have a choice around when you create the app service. So I've just created a web app in Azure, but I could have created it from Visual Studio. Now I've found it in the past, depending on which version of Visual Studio I'm running, I may have some issues getting that created from Visual Studio. I've not seen it for a while, to be fair, so it's probably fixed. But what I tend to do is create the app service resource in Azure first, like I just did, and then I get Visual Studio to point to that resource before deploying. So let's get started. If we go over to Blazor Server Demo, so that's the project, the main project, and right click it, and then I can click Publish. Now Visual Studio uses something called a publish profile to publish your app. And by default, you don't have a published profile for your project. So the first thing it will do is ask you where you're going to be publishing, and then it will use that information to find the resource you're publishing to and set up that published profile. So think of it as a template for how to publish going forward. We're going to be publishing to Azure, but as you can see, we can publish to various different places from here. We can go to a Docker container registry. If we're containerizing the application, we can publish it to a folder if we want to. So if this was actually on a web server, we could do it that way. We could publish to an FTP server, so that was quite an old school way of hosting or deploying websites, is that you would do it through an FTP server. We've obviously got IIS, which is Windows version of a web server, so Internet Information Services. So if you have a web server in your internal network which you can publish to, you can do it here, or you can import an existing profile. So if somebody on your team has already set this up, they can give you the published profile and then you can just import it on your side. So I'm going to select Azure and go next, and then it asks us what kind of Azure resource we're publishing to. So because this is a Blazor Server project, we're publishing to an Azure App Service, and we're specifically publishing to Linux. Remember, I set up Linux as the operating system for the resource. So I'll go ahead and select that, click next, and then it will use your connection to your subscription in Azure to find the relevant resources. Now, if you're not connected, which you won't be to start with, it will ask you to sign in. So you'll see a login screen. You log into your Azure account, and then it will go back to this window here in Visual Studio, and you'll see the resources that are appropriate. So as you can see, there is a create new button here. So again, you can create the resource from here, but I like to have a bit more control, to scrutinize a little bit more what I'm building, because ultimately when you create resources in any cloud provider's environment, it's going to cost money. Unless it's free, great, but you want to be sure. So I'll leave that to you, but I tend to do it via the portal. So the thing it's displaying here is the resource groups in the Azure subscription. So if you remember, I created a resource group called NICDemoRG001, catchy name. If I expand that out, you can see we have an app service, and it's Nick Blazor Publish Demo 01. So this is what we want to be publishing to. Now you can expand this out and you'll see a folder called deployment slots. Deployment slots are essentially where you split your application into two sections, staging and production. You can deploy to a specific slot and then you can swap the slots as needed. So for example, when deploying our application in my day job, we publish to an app service like this, but we publish to the staging slot first. That way we can get everything up into the cloud. We're happy that everything's good. We can do our final review of the application. And then once we're ready to go live, we go into the portal and we tell the slots to swap, and it will deploy staging into production and vice versa. That way, if anything goes wrong, then we can, instead of having to scramble to do a hotfix or to find the last version and redeploy it, we can just swap them back. And whatever was live before that was working will go back into production. So that's probably another video for more detail, but obviously for this use case, we're not deploying to any slots. We don't have any deployment slots, so I'm just going to select the app service. Click finish, and that publish profile has been created. You can tell it to automatically close when succeeded, but it happened so quickly I didn't get a chance to. So click close, and here is our profile. So we're ready to publish. So a few things here. The configuration will be the release configuration for your project. So I'm currently in debug, but obviously when I publish this, it's going to build the project first to make sure it can be deployed, because if it doesn't compile, guess what? You can't deploy it. So once it's done that, it's going to be building that in the release configuration. You can change that if you want to, but I don't really see why you would want to unless you're trying to mess around with remote debugging, which is not fun. So maybe don't, unless you have to. I'm sorry if you do. Target framework is .NET 7, so that's clear. And the deployment mode is framework dependent. So because we've already said that the app service is .NET 7, then it's expecting us to publish an application that is .NET 7. You can change this over to self-contained, and what that will do is it will bundle the runtime with the application. But the downside of that is it can make things a bit sluggish, because obviously you're bundling in all the .NET framework dependencies. So most of the time for an application like this, framework dependent, if you've already set up the application in Azure, it's fine. Target runtime is portable, so we're not targeting any specific processor architectures. Portable, again, for this use case, by default is absolutely fine. One interesting aspect of this as well, a feature that I really love, is the service dependencies. So based on the application you're deploying to, the publish profile recognizes that you have other cloud dependencies or other dependencies for the application. So SignalR, for example, Blazor Server uses SignalR. For other applications, if you've got a connection string to a SQL database in your config, then it's going to pick up that there's another SQL server in play, and it is a dependency of this application. So that's a really cool thing. It's good to see that from here you can also see what other resources in Azure are going to be potentially affected. You can edit your publish profile if you want by going to more actions. You can rename it, you can delete it, and you can restore one as well if you need to. All that remains for this is just to click publish, and you can then just watch in the output console. Now, first of all, Visual Studio is just saying that it's going to check that the application runs successfully, as I said. If it doesn't compile, you don't get to deploy it. So that's passed that test, and now it's saying that it's publishing to that Linux app service, and we'll watch the output console because you'll get a real-time view of what's happening between your machine and your Azure cloud services. So we've got the build succeeded, one publish succeeded, so that's actually published up to that app service, and it's opened the browser for me and it's gone to that URL. So at the moment it's still giving me that original page. It's probably going to wait for the app to warm up. Now notice there it took a few attempts to get this to load after I refreshed. Again, that will just be because it's catching up. The application is, I think it's restarting, so you will have a warm-up phase. But now, as you can see, if I go to that URL, then I get this site. So it was weird, I lost connection there for a second, but again, the Blazor server feature is working really well. It noticed that the backend was inaccessible for whatever reason, and it attempted to reconnect, and it did so. And I've never seen that before, so I'm really actually quite glad that happened on the video, because it means that we got to demonstrate it. But yeah, we can load the page, we can do all the stuff we would normally do in the application, and it's all good. We've deployed our app through Visual Studio up to an Azure App Service, and that's pretty much it. So I hope you found this video useful. Let me know if you're using Blazor already, and if you're publishing to Azure or any other cloud service. I really want to know how you guys work with your deployments, what challenges you've had, what works really well about deployment, and if you're using any other tools to deploy. So, I know people are going to be out there being really fancy, using the CLI, using continuous integration. DevOps is really interesting to me, even though I'm primarily an engineer. So drop a comment to let me know how you're deploying to Azure. And if you did find this video useful and you're not already subscribed, please do subscribe. It allows me to bring you lots more great .NET content.